Good afternoon, everybody. It's Stephen Phipson here. I hope you and your families are keeping safe and well today in these unprecedented times. I'd like to start by really just thanking you for taking the time out of your schedules to tune into this briefing. I hope the next 45 minutes or so will be useful and informative. And as most of you know, I am Stephen Phipson. I am the Chief Executive of Make UK, which represents around 20,000 manufacturing businesses in the country. And at Make UK, we are backing manufacturing and helping our sector to engineer a digital, global and green future. I'm really proud to represent such a forward-thinking, bold and versatile sector. I'm particularly proud to represent a sector which has and continues to step up to support the government and, importantly, the NHS in this challenging time. Today's webinar takes a look at cybercrime and how it could affect your business over the coming months. The coronavirus, or COVID-19, is an issue that has deeply affected all of our lives over the past 8 weeks. We know that the manufacturing industry has been hit hard by the restrictions, as workers are increasingly having to work remotely, as suppliers are unable to move goods, and as we, as a nation, struggle to cope with the increasing number of cases. These problems, increasingly, however, we've become aware of a side effect, which has massively increased the amount of cyber criminal activity. These threats are actively taking a course without proper cybersecurity awareness and infrastructure. And I don't say this lightly. I'm in good company. Today, GCHQ issued a press in the UK. The organization has been affected by the coronavirus. Developing a stringent cybersecurity approach is essential to ensure that you do not lose more capital. The risks implicit in a cyber breach are well known: data loss, public liability, even government intervention. Because of the emergency working measures that have been put in place, and especially because of the rapid deployment of many remote working devices, cyber criminals are able to exploit weaknesses. The National Fraud Intelligence Bureau has estimated a 400% increase in cyber attacks on home workers since the coronavirus pandemic struck. Cybersecurity is and must be a board-level responsibility. You are responsible for protecting our assets against these threats. Statistically, over 60% of UK businesses experienced a phishing attack last year. That statistic comes from the Checkpoint Research Security report from 2019. With the increased number of attacks coming in the wake of COVID-19, we could well see a huge increase in this already high number. In harder-hit countries, this is already apparent. Italy saw over 10% of their businesses experience some form of cyber attack in March of this year. Even if only a tiny proportion of these attacks are successful, the risk is enormous. Without being able to rely on firewalls and on-premises defenses, remote working has always carried some security weaknesses. Now, as this international state of emergency continues to develop, there is a risk of this event evolving into a full-blown cyber disaster. In terms of what we can do to prevent this, cybersecurity is more important than ever. Make UK's priority in this area is to keep employers and employees safe and protected, without the worry of additional financial outlays. So we've teamed up with Assured Cyber Protection to provide our members with a practical way of protecting themselves, an immediate cyber protection solution that can be remotely and quickly deployed. This will be supported with a delayed payment plan of 6 months that will enable businesses of all sizes to protect its remote workforce and critical data. Therefore, we put this webinar together. We hope to inform you and give you the tools you need to protect your businesses, not in a few months' time, but now. Proactivity is key. Ensure that your business is adequately protected from cyber threats and that your employees are aware of how they can actively help defend your networks. Cyber protection is more important than it has been ever before. So at this point, I'd like to introduce you now to an expert in this field. Drew Perry is known as the Hacker CEO and the CEO Hacker. He is cleared to a high UK government standard and has sat on a number of advisory boards relating to national cyber security. Drew may well be one of the most well-informed hackers and cyber security professionals in the world. He will be providing a short briefing today on the real risk and threats to manufacturers and the impact. live case studies and incidents to share, you'll get to understand the mind of the hacker. The implications of the COVID-19 attack are many, and this problem is not one that's going to disappear overnight. So we must be prepared. So with that said, we'll be answering some questions at the end of the webinar. So if Drew doesn't answer any specific queries you have, please do stick around. So now over to you, Drew, please.
Thank you very much. It's quite an impressive intro there. Thank you. So yes, my name is Drew and I am a hacker. I teach fellow C-level executives to hack, which I must admit is a very, very powerful and useful skill to have at this point in time. So I break into buildings and steal trade secrets. I plant bugs and listening devices. I conduct fraudulent in-store payments using cloned cards. And importantly, I know your password. I know the password or a password that has been used by probably half the humans on this planet. And amazingly, I do all of this legally. So let me just go into a little bit of a background on where I've come from and what I do. So I was born and raised in a small, I was lucky that it was home to one of the first attempts in the world to make a national crime database. It was called the Wanganui supercomputer. But what this did was create a very large anarchist and hacker community in my town, which I was lucky enough to be surrounded by when growing up. So I got my first Commodore Amiga computer when I was 3 years old in 1989. And what I discovered was my thirst for knowledge was intense. Internet access was very, very hard to come by. School to me was pretty useless. All I could do was take a typing class and learn how to become a typist. So what that did is it drove me to obtain knowledge by any means necessary. So I call this the true hacker spirit. So I did this by, well, I guess breaking into computer systems. But luckily, by the time I was old enough to get a real job, I chose the right path, some of the largest corporations in the world. So what I'm here to talk to you today about unprecedented times of COVID-19, lockdown and remote working. But before going into that in detail, I just want to recap on the different types of cyber threat actor groups we are up against these days. So we have classic cyber criminals. They're economically motivated, financially motivated to most likely ransomware your business and try and make money. So a lot of these cyber gangs are in economies and countries where it's not hard to get a job. It's difficult to get a job, so they can make a lot of money using their technical skills to do this. They do this via phishing, malvertising, and ransomwaring at the end of the day. We also have terrorists. From that perspective, luckily, they are still human. So therefore, in this current climate, are still susceptible to COVID-19. Interestingly, ISIS have issued a religious directive to cease all global jihad at this point in time. But what concerns me about that is if they're not physically traveling anywhere to carry out physical attacks, are they then ramping up their cyber capabilities to carry out attacks that way to disrupt national critical infrastructure and carry out attacks that way? We also have to consider insiders and staff as potential cyber threat actors. Furloughed staff and anyone who's been laid off could potentially be disgruntled. They could be in a situation where they can abuse trust, they can abuse access, get access to sensitive materials. So as much as we want to trust our fellow colleagues, we also have to be suspicious sometimes and make sure we have the right technical controls to detect suspicious behaviors. And then at the top of the chain, we have our nation-state threat actors. Our nation-state threat actors are, I guess I'd refer to them as, the big boys, the ones of capabilities, very, very sophisticated, with intelligence-driven goals. So in this current climate, we've already seen examples of nations taking advantage of this. One example is the Iranian Health Ministry have actually released spyware in conjunction with their COVID-19 to their own citizens. This could have been another nation getting in that communication chain to actually mess with them. It's hard to actually know what goes on at these levels, but it's an example of the types of threats we are up against. So since this global pandemic kicked off a few months ago, obviously we had early warnings of what was coming from late December out of Wuhan, but from a cyber attack perspective, we've seen a huge increase in phishing-related attacks, pretending to be official government communications, doctors, airlines, all encouraging their users to enter personal information, such as usernames and passwords, or click on links, all related to COVID-19. Basically, they're capitalizing on anxiety and our fears. So the uptick we saw in the number of domains and IP addresses and phishing-related emails actually began in early February. So this kind of demonstrates the speed and greed of some of these cyber criminals and how fast they adapt their techniques to jump onto this and take advantage of the situation. So from a positive perspective, a couple of crime gangs, cybercrime gangs, actually declared a truce or ceasefire to not target medical organizations and hospitals. This was two specific groups, one called Maze and one called Doppelpaymer, rather notorious groups that make a lot of money ransomwaring businesses. But the problem with this is, yes, they say they're not going to target medical organizations and hospitals, but from a technical level, how can they do this? Their bots are spreading out and flooding our inboxes, waiting for anyone to click on a link. So in theory, if they were to encrypt a hospital or a medical organization's data, they would offer free decryption to get this back without having to pay the ransom, which is usually half a Bitcoin or more if they're greedy. But can we really trust them? I mean, you're trusting a cybercrime organization to give you your data back. What's stopping them coming back around again when all this is over and planting a backdoor in your environment to trigger at a future date? One thing I will point out is Doppelpaymer, the specific ransomware group, they started leaking a large number of manufacturing companies' trade secrets to the dark web starting a few months ago. And this, from a supply chain perspective, it actually also impacted Tesla Motors. So it's quite concerning that these threat actors, if you do not pay the ransom, they will actually leak this to the dark web, and there will be massive repercussions on that from a business perspective. So what we need to do is, well, basically prevent this stuff from happening. But the challenge with that is we're in a new world. We're in a new world where remote working is, well, our only option unless you're an essential worker, unless you're doing a job which requires you to still physically go somewhere. And what that does is increases the threat from cyber criminals, not just from a business perspective, but from a personal perspective as well. So as I mentioned, the remote working risks is not every company has a strong work from home culture or policies in place for things like bring your own device. So staff may end up using company assets to carry out their work. So the questions you need to ask your IT team is, do they know what patch levels these devices are at? Are updates being applied? Do these devices have endpoint protection in place with the latest antivirus signatures installed? There's a lot of unknowns, and ramping up a new work from home culture is not necessarily an easy thing to do. So in theory, this can lead to new tools or products being used that have not been through a strict sign-off process or technical review. So an example of that is Zoom video conferencing. But in reality, there could also be issues around IT teams lacking monitoring and detection visibility. So basically, if these new devices are being introduced into the environment outside of normal channels, and combined with a potential due to sickness, maybe due to them not being able to carry out their job function, it's leading to attackers being less likely to be detected within your environment. The other thing to consider is home working environments actually bring some unique risks, specifically with the prevalence of home automation and home assistance devices. Remember, they are constantly listening. Your phone's sitting there listening to you. Alexa's sitting there listening to you. Your Google Home is constantly listening. So staff need to be wary of sort of where in the house they're having these sensitive business conversations. I feel this is, a data leak waiting to happen. So also consider when on video conferencing calls, what's being shown in the background of your webcam. So I've seen a theme on social media where people are sharing photos of their current workspace. And as a hacker, I say thanks, because now I know what software you're using. So now I know that I can craft a specific phishing attack that will likely exploit a vulnerability in that software. So the key thing here is to refresh your staff security awareness training. Just a quick 10-minute session or email updating them on, new work from home best practice. Remind them they are the first line of defense, and that technology is here to help. And the fact that we're not, they should not be reprimanded or get into any form of trouble if they do happen to click on something and something goes wrong. So you need to incentivize your staff to report these things and communicate as quickly as possible. So I'd now like to go on to the types of attacks that we're seeing and what they look like. The three major attack types we're currently seeing relating to COVID-19 actually still the same as before. So they are denial of service, business email compromise, and phishing. There's not actually much change going on here, but importantly, the tactics and targets have adapted. We're even at a point where hospitals and vaccine research labs, as I mentioned earlier, are being ransomwared. Even though there's this truce with two major threat actor groups, there's still a whole lot more out there that still want to make money. Specifically, there were cases within Spain and Czech Republic where this has occurred recently. So it really demonstrates the ugly side of humanity. We're also seeing denial of service attacks being performed against food delivery services. So as a key service while on lockdown, that is a major, major issue. And finally, obviously, business email compromise. So that is when an attacker can use the trust in a relationship to request payments like an invoice or a fee to be paid. They're abusing the stressful situation that we're all in. In reality, not a lot has changed from the types of attacks. It's still the same old attacks that can be defended against with basic cyber hygiene in the same ways. The ways that these are being carried out are slightly different at this point in time. So the specific threats to manufacturers. So the one specific issue here we need to talk about is the loss or potential loss of intellectual property. So your plans, your designs, your bid details, your customer lists. These are all incredibly valuable targets to a threat actor. And not just cyber criminal gangs, these are valuable targets to nation-state threat actors, so advanced persistent threat groups, as I referred to them earlier as, the big boys and girls. So nation-state threat actors are jumping again on this COVID-19 theme. My biggest concern is actually the risk from Chinese-based threat actor groups, such as APT-12, Ephemeral Hydra, and Winty Group, just to name a few. So I've been involved in a number of incident response investigations where the breach has been attributed back to these groups. And I have to admit, they are very, very sophisticated in their techniques. They move through your network and steal trade secrets with ease, and they are very hard to detect. It's a kind of a bleak picture, but that's the world we live in. But there is one common theme here, and that's the initial infection vector. So they are mostly all getting a foothold within the network via phishing. They are carrying out successful phishing attacks. Because at the end of the day, humans are the weakest link, and we all have flaws that can easily be exploited. So what they're doing is they're creating, via these phishing emails, an impression of authenticity to actually spoof sender information. So to appear like an email is coming from the World Health Organization, or using titles in their name, such as from a doctor, a trusted source, all trying to entice you to click on that link, open that website, enter your details. At this point, if your monitoring and detection capability is not up to scratch, they're going to have free reign in your network for quite some time until you're lucky enough to actually detect them. I'll just point out, we can't forget about the Russian threat as well. They are very sophisticated cyber threat actors. So they've actually been releasing some malware that has previously been financially motivated, and they've recently been targeting two European companies in the pharmaceutical and manufacturing industry in the past few months, along the themes of this COVID-19 phishing emails. So what can we learn from this? We need to make sure you have a robust incident response plan in place. So I urge you to go and ask your Chief Information Security Officer if you have one. What monitoring is in place? How do you and the board, how would you respond to a loss of intellectual property via this type of compromise? I can suggest maybe practicing these types of scenarios in tabletop exercises. Be prepared, work out your communication strategy to be prepared for a situation like this occurring. So a few real-life incidents and case studies. So as mentioned, cyber criminals are using COVID-19 as clickbait. An interesting one is a newly developed app for iPhone and Android. It's called COVID Lock. So it's a phone app that claims to check the spread of infections in the local area. So once a user actually installs this, their contacts, their photos, their social media accounts, they're all locked until a ransom is paid. And think about that in this current state we live in. Phones have never really been targeted by threat actors before on a grand scale. We've gone after desktop machines, laptops, servers. But think about how critical your phone is during lockdown. Your phone and laptop are now locked. How are you going to conduct business? How are you going to communicate with your staff? Another example was actually last week. I was involved in an incident where a client was a victim of business email compromise. So an email was received claiming to be, in fact, from the CEO, approving a transaction worth £8 million, which, this is not a normal type of transaction that would occur, but amazingly, the finance team actually processed that payment. The attacker sort of played on the uncertainty and time pressures and was also sending from what looked like a legitimate email. As a side note, the company had not actually secured their email system with something called DMARC, which prevents this type of spoofing occurring. And luckily in the situation, the bank stopped the transaction, but they were only able to recover £7 million. So they still lost £1 million based on this attack. So for a cyber criminal, that's not bad for a day's work of sending a few emails. So yes, the threat is real. So what I'd like to do, I'd just like to finish on a story. I mentioned earlier that I physically break into buildings, do plant devices, steal trade secrets, and compromise desktops and servers legally, I might add. The companies are authorizing this to occur to demonstrate the real world risk. So I'd like to tell you a story of a situation that I found myself in New York. So while I tell the story, just think about, how physically secure is your premises during this lockdown. What if someone turned up wearing a mask, wearing gloves, with social distancing of 2 meters being in place? Are ID badges going to be checked? Can someone walk in the front or back door of your organization? And if they do you have the right technical controls in place to stop them then compromising your machines? So I like to ask the question, can your corporate location be physically compromised in less than 5 minutes? And I would say most likely. And I base that on experience of actually doing this. So the way we do it is, we have a mission. So we have a goal that a company would want us to achieve. So in this situation, we had a building in New York. It was 50 floors, and our goal was to gain physical entry to 2 floors of that organization, the 20th floor and the 21st floor. We were there. Once we were in, we were tasked with deploying USB keys throughout the office environment that contained fake malware, so we could track if they were being plugged in. The other goal was to implant a listening device near the finance team to see if they were following process of not discussing sensitive transactions at their desk. We then wanted to exfiltrate trade secrets and finally compromise their desktops and then move within their environment to access the servers that contained some sensitive information. So I always start these engagements by carrying out reconnaissance. And that's not just physical reconnaissance. This is open source intelligence gathering as well. So this is going out onto the open web, the dark web, gathering leaked usernames and passwords and creating a full digital footprint of an organization. So working out what their IP addresses are, what websites exist, what vulnerabilities exist that I can then exploit. I can use some of this information when I'm physically on site, because if a staff member's username and password has previously been leaked, and I'll point out that, as I said earlier, I know your password, and this is what I mean by this. I have a database of millions, tens of millions of leaked credentials that will most likely contain your company's passwords in them, because users reuse passwords. They sign up for social media sites and other sites, which they probably shouldn't do, and then reuse that password for their corporate access. So I come in with a list of that. I then physically survey the perimeter. So I'm looking for entrances, I'm looking for exits, I'm looking for staff entrances and goods entrances. So in this particular situation, I arrived under the cover of darkness the day before I was going to compromise this company. I found a goods entrance down the side street off Lexington Avenue. I took photos of that. I took photos of all of the entrances and exits as mentioned. Then went back to my hotel room and conducted out the plan of attack for the next day. So armed with this information, I arrived at the goods entrance and amazingly, within 30 seconds of being there, a flower delivery person turned up. So this is not something I prearranged. This was just by chance, because this building, very, very popular, people coming and going all the time. So as the flower delivery person went in, I tailgated behind him. He distracted the person behind the counter at the sign-in desk, and I got straight into the goods elevator. So I then found myself on the 20th floor of the building. I immediately started dropping my USB keys around. These USB keys, as I said, were loaded with simulated malware to be able to track if users were plugging them in the office or at home. But I took it a step further and wrote some very interesting things on them, such as bonus list, redundancy list, payroll list, passwords. So it's really enticing and encouraging for someone who sees that written on a key to plug it in. I'm happy to report that all of them were actually handed into the IT security team, and I wasn't actually successful with that one. But it just goes to show physically testing this stuff is very, very important. So I'm still on the floor. I haven't been detected at this point. No one's asking me any details. I get into an office and I find trade secrets on the desk. I find an unlocked machine and I run a command on there, and then I'm on that endpoint. That calls back to someone outside the business within my team to continue compromising them that way. So another mission objective accomplished. And then at that point in time, I was approached by someone questioning why I was at this desk. But the thing is that they weren't concerned that I was there at all. They were more concerned that the person whose office I was in was about to come back from lunch, and would I be done by then? So I told them I'm an IT auditor. I'm doing an asset tag audit, and the ID that I have on my fake document that I created didn't match up with what I was seeing on the machine. So I said, right, I need to take this machine with me. So I unplugged it, put it under my arm, and walked out of the building. So basically, at that point, I had accomplished all of the objectives. I demonstrated the real-world risk to this organization and physically stolen a full machine under my arm without really being stopped. So think about that story in this current in this current locked down world. If a motivated cyber threat actor or criminal wanted to perform this, would they be successful? You know, as I said, with social distancing, these types of risks are also quite concerning. So also think about this for your remote workers and your home-based environments. You know, are you potentially going to lose laptops? And if you do, are they encrypted with full disk encryption? So there are technical controls to prevent you from this, these types of things happening to you. And I'd just like to point out the one thing to prevent these types of social engineering attacks is to know your staff and to train your staff. So question unfamiliar faces. So on that note, I'd like to thank you very much and hand over to my colleague at ACP.
Drew, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules to attend this webinar and hear about the importance of cybersecurity and, of course, Drew's Meet the Hacker session. I'll keep you for only a few minutes more. I'm Mitch Sher, the CEO of Assured Cyber Protection. We are Make UK's cyber security partner, chosen to develop cyber services designed specifically for their members, tailored to the needs of the manufacturing industry and especially to small to medium enterprises. Our organisation has over 6 decades of combined cybersecurity knowledge, and we are here to help and answer any queries you might have after today's webinar. Now, a few words on cybersecurity from my own experience. Until now, you and your employees have been working in a relatively speaking sanitized environment within your corporate office. Now, though, many, if not all, of your employees are working from home, protecting themselves and us all to prevent the spread of coronavirus. In so doing, they are inadvertently exposing your business to another type of infection, that caused by digital viruses. As reported widely today, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre has issued warnings about individuals in the UK being targeted by coronavirus-themed phishing emails, with infected attachments containing fictitious safety measures. These attachments, if opened, can wreak havoc across networks. To help support you, we have developed a remote cyber protection solution in partnership with Make UK to protect your business. Understanding that this is a difficult time and cash flow is most important, we offer this protection on a buy now and wholly unsympathetic are preying on and actively attacking your businesses. As Stephen alluded to in his introduction, cyber threats have increased by over 400% in some sectors, including the NHS. This is unforgivable. Assured Cyber Protection is honoured to work with Make UK and to be of service to you so that we can keep your businesses safe from the risk of cyber attack. We have bundled our own, so please stick around from all of us today.
Downtime due to ransomware. So I'd just like to reiterate basic cyber hygiene. So training your staff, applying system updates, making sure your security team and IT team monitor for suspicious behavior, and also have policies in place so everyone knows what to do when things go wrong.
As a priority in these times, is it remote workers that need protecting most?
Yeah, I mean, well, pretty much everyone is now a remote worker, as I alluded to before, unless you're obviously an essential worker physically still going into a location. But yeah, absolutely, you need to ensure that they're aware of the risks and they have you have the right technology in place to actually support a secure remote working experience.
Breaches can mean financial losses, but are there any legal ramifications?
Interesting. So a case I was working on earlier in this week. So a customer is actually suing a service provider claiming negligence because they didn't apply some very specific updates and patches to a server, and it got breached. And this was actually relating to the Citrix vulnerability. If anyone on the call may have heard from their IT teams about the chaos of that across December and January. Over 80,000 companies were vulnerable and exposed, and a vast number of those machines got breached. So yeah, this customer I was working with, they're being sued for £1 million at this point in time. So just factor that in to your calculations when assessing the cost of cleanup based on a breach. And I guess make sure that you've got cyber insurance in place to cover these situations.
What do you do?
Sorry, I just wanted to point out one extra thing there. And do not forget, under GDPR, if you do not report to the ICO, it's not necessarily a legal ramification, but the cost of fines from the ICO if not following that process correctly.
Thank you. We've also just had another question through. What do you do when it's discovered? What should you do if you discover that you've been hacked or breached? Well,
if you discovered it, you're lucky, because most breaches you actually get notified via third parties. But yeah, what do? You implement your incident response plan. You have one of those, right? Quite possibly not. So you need to make sure you communicate effectively with impacted partners, customers, and the public. I feel there's nothing worse than a PR statement claiming we take data security very seriously, and they come out and say that at the time of being a breach. So obviously you do not take data security very seriously. So making sure you have a proper, honest, transparent communication strategy, and also following on from what I just said before, determine if the ICO does need to be notified. If there's any personal data involved in the breach, just remember you have 72 hours under GDPR from being made aware to report. And then finally, I guess, speak with NCSC. They can help you through this process, or lean on your trusted suppliers, or bring in some expertise externally to help you through this process as well.
Thank you. And also, there's been a lot in the press about video conferencing not being secure. Is it risky? Is it too risky to use?
Well, it can't be too risky to use because we're in a world where we
Okay, it looks like we've
Natasha.
lost Drew. Are you there, Drew?
No, it's Andrew. Natasha, I think I can just finish off that answer for Drew if you'd like me to.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think Drew was going to allude to the fact that many of us are using video conferencing. It's been used, tried and tested for many years already. True end-to-end encryption can't be achieved through video conferencing. So advice would be not to disclose anything too sensitive over video conferencing, but by all means still use it. It's as safe as any other means of communications that we can rely on these days.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like us to cover before we finish today?
Nothing from me, Natasha. It's been a great session, I think.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate you being here. We've had lots of questions. Thank you for sending them through. We won't leave any questions unanswered, so if you have any more, please do send them through to us. And if you would like any further information or support, please email us at inquiries@makeuk.org